Hello, and welcome to the Thinking Jew podcast, where we dive deep into Torah and Judaism to uncover its hidden beauty. Come join us as we take a closer look and breathe new life into traditional Jewish ideas. And now, here's your host, Rabbi Moshe Siegel.
Hello and welcome to episode 64. The holiday of Purim is right around the corner, coming up next Thursday, so I figured it'd be a great time to discuss one of the themes of Purim. If you want to hear some extra thoughts on Purim, you can also check out episode 13 and 15 of this podcast, which has some great and relevant thoughts about Purim from last year. The basic story of Purim is relatively well known. The Jews were in exile after the destruction of the first temple, and the current world power was the Persian Empire. The Megillah teaches us that Achashverosh was the king, and he hosted a feast for all of the men of his kingdom, and it was during this feast that he requested the Queen Vashti to come. She refuses to come, and he has her killed. This eventually leads to searching for a new queen, and Esther eventually being chosen. When Haman later rose to power, Esther was in a position high enough to persuade the king, and as we know, the story ends with the victory for the Jews, and the death of Haman, his family, and all of the Jew haters that existed then. One of the themes that comes out of the story is a concept called Vinahafoch Hu, which means it was reversed. Sometimes things appear so difficult, so bleak, it's almost impossible to imagine how they could improve. In the Purim story, Haman convinced King Achashverosh to sign a letter with his royal seal to wipe out all of the Jews, men, women, and children, on a specific date. Imagine the fear. There's no hope possible. The date was set. The letter was signed by the king himself, and the highest minister in the royal court was the one overseeing the project. But as we know, it changed. And not only did it change, but it was reversed 180 degrees. Not only was it not bad for the Jews in the end, but it actually turned out to an amazing day of joy and celebration. It wasn't just that the fear was removed, but rather all of those elements became inherently positive. That's the basic concept of Vinahafoch Hu, that it was a complete reversal. The most explicit example of this in the Megillah is the tree that Haman built. The Megillah writes how Mordechai didn't bow down to Haman, and this bothered Haman so much, to the extent that Haman himself says that even though he has all of this wealth, all of this honor that the king has bestowed upon him, and he has so many kids and a beautiful family, Haman proclaims it all worthless in as long as he has to walk past Mordechai and see Mordechai in the king's palace. So in the Megillah, Haman's family and friends advise him to build a gallows, a large tree 50 amos tall, and in the morning ask the king Achashverosh for permission to hang Mordechai on it. Basically, take out Mordechai and you can move on with your life. Haman loves this idea and builds the gallows. Before Haman gets the opportunity to ask for the king's permission, Esther reveals to the king that she's Jewish and that Haman is trying to destroy her and her entire wider family. King Achashverosh gets so angry that he decides to have Haman hanged right away. And the Megillah tells us that he hangs Haman on the very tree that Haman prepared for Mordechai. So we see that it wasn't just that Mordechai avoided the bad intentions of Haman, but rather Haman's own bad intentions were reversed onto himself. He himself was hanged on that very same gallows that he erected for Mordechai. Imagine for a minute you're a Jew in Shushan during that time. You see Haman erect this gallows with explicit intent to kill your leader Mordechai after he already established he's going to wipe out all of the Jews. No one could have possibly imagined that Haman himself and eventually his sons as well would actually be killed and hanged on that very same tree. But that's the concept of Vinahafoch Hu. Sometimes things appear so terrible that we just wish to get out of these issues. But the truth is that from God's perspective, He doesn't just allow you to avoid these issues, but these issues are actually the messengers themselves that bring forth your salvation. They become your greatest blessings. Another example of this theme is the Megillah actually uses the words Vinahafoch Hu regarding the war between the Jews and their enemies. Haman originally granted permission for anyone to kill every single Jew. And although the king couldn't take back a letter he signed, once Achashverosh recognizes who Haman really was, who Esther really is, he allows Esther and Mordechai to send out an additional letter saying that the Jews have the ability to not only fight back and protect themselves, but even to avenge their enemies. So the Megillah writes, "And in the 12th month of Adar, on the 13th day, the very day in which the enemies of the Jews planned to rule over the Jews, and the opposite happened, Vinahafoch Hu, and the Jews got their enemies in their power." This day on the calendar, which for many months represented the day of the Jews' destruction, that very same day became the day when they were able to rid themselves of their vicious anti-Semitic neighbors. And the truth is that in the bigger picture historical sense, this theme of Vinahafoch Hu was really at play as well. The backdrop of the whole story of Purim is that when the first temple was destroyed, the prophets prophesied that the Jews would be in exile for 70 years, and then they would return to Jerusalem and rebuild the temple. Achashverosh mistakenly calculated those 70 years were complete, and therefore concluded that God must have given up on the Jewish nation. They were no longer going to be redeemed, no longer going to build the temple, which meant that he would continue to retain his position of power over the world. According to the Talmud, this was actually the reason for Achashverosh's feast in the beginning of the Purim story. He was celebrating the completion of the 70 years and the fact that the temple wasn't rebuilt. And in truth, it was really a big political debate at that time whether the Jews should attend this meal or not. Mordechai warned the Jews not to go to this meal. How could you go? It's celebrating the destruction of the temple. But on the other side, the Jews felt that if the king invites our community to a meal and no one shows up, how would that look? So if you think about it, the theme of Achashverosh's whole party was a celebration of the temple remaining destroyed. But what comes out of this party? Achashverosh kills his wife Vashti and eventually replaces her with Esther. And interestingly, even when Achashverosh professes his love to Esther in the Megillah, and he says, "My dear Esther, my queen, ask of me anything that you want, and I shall give it to you, up to half of my kingdom, and it will be yours." The Talmud explains this phrase. What was Achashverosh referring to when he says, "up to half of my kingdom"? Says the Talmud, he was referring to the temple. He said, "You can ask of anything that you want except for the temple to be rebuilt." That's off the table. But what comes from this union? Achashverosh and Esther, the Midrash teaches us, have a child named Darius. Darius eventually becomes king, and Darius is the one that allows the Jews to rebuild the temple. So it comes out that that very same feast that Achashverosh thought he was celebrating the temple not being rebuilt was actually planting the seeds for the rebuilding of the second temple. Unbelievable. And this is one of the great themes of Purim, again, Vinahafoch Hu. It's recognizing that we don't understand so much of what's going on around us. And while so many things appear to us to be terrible, in an instant, God can reverse them 180 degrees and use that very same incident that we thought was tragic as a moment of tremendous joy. The deeper sources teach us that this day, the day of the fast of Esther, which was historically the day in which the Megillah describes as being reversed in the Jews' favor, that was the day of the great battle in which the Jews were able to destroy many of their enemies. This day nowadays remains an auspicious time to pray to God to reverse the negative parts of our lives. If there's a difficult issue you're dealing with, or something very complicated going on in your life, bring these events to God during this time of Vinahafoch Hu, and we pray to God with full belief that He has the ability to reverse them, and not only to help us out of these struggles, but to actually turn these struggles from difficulty into joy, from mourning into happiness. I give us all a blessing that we should take advantage of this great time that we're entering into, and may God save all of us from our personal difficulties, from our national difficulties, and lead us all to a time of peace and happiness with the coming of Mashiach speedily in our days. Until next time, wishing everyone an amazing week.
Thank you for listening to the Thinking Jew podcast and for taking the time to study Torah and deepen your connection to Judaism. If you found value in today's episode, please leave us a rating or review and subscribe to the podcast. If you have any questions, comments, or topic requests for Rabbi Moshe, please email thethinkingJewPodcast@gmail.com or visit thethinkingjew.com.